There's an old saying that history is written by the winners. However, this adage is far more relevant when it comes to ancient civilizations. Thousands of years ago, it was far more common for the losers of a war to be completely eradicated or absorbed, and even in cases where that didn't happen, records from the larger, more powerful empire are more likely to be the ones that survive for millennia.
This cannot be done.
But in modern times, where it is rare for a war to result in the absorption or dissolution of entire nation states, both sides of a conflict have the opportunity to write their own history books. In general, these books will have wildly different accounts of what happened and why. So today, we'll be looking at 4 historical events that are taught completely differently in other countries. The American Revolution is one of the most important events in American history. Without it, the United States wouldn't even be its own country. It's where elementary school history class begins in the US, and they learn about the heroes and patriots that fought against a tyrannical British government to forever free themselves from the monarchy and create the greatest nation the world has ever seen. It's a very even-handed representation of events, unclouded by nationalism. But how is the American Revolution, or as they call it, the American War of Independence, taught in England? Do British schoolchildren learn about the band of ungrateful terrorists who revolted against the crown because they didn't want to pay their fair share of taxes like the rest of the British Empire? Are they taught about brave heroes like Benedict Arnold, Joseph Galloway, and Thomas Hutchinson with the same level of detail and mythos with which American children learn about Paul Revere, Patrick Henry, and George Washington? Now, once upon a time, that may have been true, and there are accounts of older British texts describing the American colonists as being ungrateful for the protection and economic benefits that England had provided them. However, it's been a long time since that was the case. To start, the Americans and the British have been extremely close allies for much longer than anyone watching this video has been alive. There are no longer any hard feelings between the two nations, even if you can't pronounce maths correctly. So there's no reason for England to propagandize the war to make the United States look like horrible villains. More importantly though, the war just isn't that important to the British. To Americans, the American Revolution was fought for freedom, democracy, and the right to self-governance. It was the event that led to the creation of the United States, and the battles were fought within the nation's borders, and many of these are now national landmarks. Nothing could be more important to Americans and the history of their nation. But to the British, one of their colonies rising up and revolting against British rule was just another Tuesday. And from the British perspective, the American Revolution was hardly the most important of the colonial rebellions. That was all happening an ocean away, and there were colonies closer to home that had a much greater impact on the empire. Today, the American Revolution is little more than a footnote in British classrooms. It is mostly seen as being important not because it was yet another colony that England was losing control of, but because of France's involvement in the war. Wanting revenge for their defeat during the 7 Years' War, France provided financial and military support to the colonists, hoping it could serve as a sort of proxy war against England. The burden of financing this war created an economic crisis that, when combined with the revolutionary ideology French soldiers brought back from the colonies, paved the way for the French Revolution. Because of its closer proximity to England and the large impact it had on Europe as a whole, the French Revolution is seen as far more important from a historical perspective, and the American Revolution is just some extra context for that event that teachers may or may not even bother to mention. Sticking with US-British relations for a moment, let's jump forward a few decades, what is sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence. Beginning in June of 1812, and not officially ending until February of 1815, the War of 1812 can best be described as a dumb and pointless waste of lives and resources. This is best exemplified by the Treaty of Ghent, the peace agreement that restored status quo antebellum, Latin for the situation as it existed before the war. It was agreed that everything would go back to the way it was before the fighting began, with no change in territorial borders. Not only did neither nation gain anything as a result of the war, but the treaty also failed to address any of the concerns that caused the war to arise in the first place, meaning that nothing was actually resolved. Despite the war being fought to a stalemate, it remains a point of national pride for the United States. The war began thanks to England not wanting the US to trade with their rival France. British ships would board the American merchant ships and impress the sailors into the Royal Navy, which the US saw as a violation of its independence. Because this is sometimes viewed as the Second War of Independence, and because the United States did not fall back under British rule, it is safe to assume that many Americans view the War of 1812 as successful. Though some schools do teach that it ended in a stalemate, many teach it as a US victory. More important, it is the origin of some of America's greatest legends. The lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner, the US national anthem, come from Francis Scott Key's poem about the Battle of Baltimore during the war. There is also the story of Andrew Jackson's major military victory at the Battle of Orleans, even though the peace treaty had already been signed before the battle. Oh, and the British also burned down the White House, but Americans try not to focus on that. But most importantly, the war is seen as solidifying the United States as a major player on the international stage. They may not have won the war, but they took on the British Empire and didn't lose, which was close enough to winning as far as the fledgling nation was concerned. For England's part, they care even less about this war than they did about the American Revolution, and it rarely receives any attention in schools there. In Canada, however, it is completely different. Canada was a British colony at the time, and much of the fighting took place between troops along the US-Canada border and neighboring cities. To Canadians, the War of 1812 is a really big deal. Students in the US are taught that they won the war, but it's also not a major focus. The entire war is usually covered in 2 or 3 days, and then classes move on to do other things. But in Canada, students can expect to spend 3 to 4 months learning about their victorious defense against the invading Americans. Much of the population of Canada was made up of British loyalists who fled the United States after the American Revolution, and the War of 1812 is seen as fundamental in creating a national identity for Canadians. After all, there weren't a lot of British troops occupying the area at the time, so most of the fighting was done by Canadian militias and their Indigenous allies. From this arose the figures that would become Canadian folk heroes. Heroes like Laura II, a Massachusetts-born loyalist who fled to Canada. When invading American soldiers were quartered in her home, she overheard their plans and walked 20 miles through harsh terrain to warn British soldiers. Or Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief and warrior who had formed an intertribal confederacy that fought alongside the Canadians to prevent further American expansion. And of course, there were more traditional war heroes as well, like General Isaac Brock of the British Army. So while the War of 1812 accomplished nothing, the United States didn't fall back under British rule, and Canada wasn't annexed by the United States. As such, both sides claimed it as a victory and continued to teach it that way, though in Canada there is a much stronger emphasis on the war than in the United States. There have been a lot of controversies surrounding Japanese textbooks and their attempts to whitewash the actions of Imperial Japan during World War II and the Second Sino-Japanese War. There's certainly good reason for the controversy as well. While Germany is often seen as the paragon of education, or when it comes to a nation properly teaching about a war they lost without shying away from even the most horrific details of their own actions, Japan is an extreme example of the other direction. Thanks to Japan's fundamental law of education, there is a textbook authorization system that requires all textbooks to receive approval from the Ministry of Education. Although no one specific textbook is forced on students, schools can only choose to use textbooks that have been properly vetted by the ministry. Now, at first blush, that doesn't sound too crazy. It's easy to argue that the Ministry of Education is ensuring that textbooks are of an appropriate standard, lest students receive books teaching them that 1 × 1 is 2. However, the ministry has used this authority to remove anything they deem objectionable from history books. This is problematic when it comes to teaching about World War II, because the Japanese famously committed a whole lot of war crimes. From murdering civilians to biological warfare experiments, killing prisoners of war to abducting women and girls for sexual slavery, it seemed that there was nothing that was off limits for the Imperial Japanese Army. Combine the atrocities committed by their military with the fact that Japan was on the losing side of the war, and it turns out that they would just prefer not to talk about it. In fact, textbooks barely cover those years at all. One textbook had only 19 pages covering all of 1931 to 1945, which encompassed both World War II and the Sino-Japanese War. Amidst that, there was only a single sentence covering the atomic bombs, which should make it clear the level of detail, or lack thereof, that these history books were going into. As historian Stephen Ambrose famously put it in his book, To America, Personal Reflections of a Historian, quote, "The Japanese presentation of the war to its children runs something like this. One day, for no reason we ever understood, the Americans started dropping atomic bombs on us." However, there's actually another interesting difference about Japan and World War II when it comes to Russia. In the United States, and indeed much of the West, it is taught that the Japanese surrendered because the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in Russian textbooks, that's not the reason that is given. Instead, they take credit for defeating Japan. A quick timeline for context here. The bombing of Hiroshima occurred on the 6th of August. On the 8th of August, Stalin officially declared war against Japan. On August the 9th, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The same day, just hours before the bomb was dropped, Russian soldiers engaged the Japanese in Manchuria. Within 10 days, the Russians had plowed their way through the Imperial Japanese forces occupying the Asian continent, and they were ready to push onward to mainland Japan. While it wouldn't be fair to say that Russia's march toward mainland Japan was inconsequential, the idea that Russian aggression, rather than the threat of total nuclear annihilation, was the determining factor in Japan's surrender is a minority opinion that seems relegated almost entirely to Russian textbooks. Most of you watching this are too old to have learned about the 9/11 attacks from a textbook, instead having lived through it. How the events are handled in schools in the US isn't fully standardized yet, but there are a few consistent elements about how it is taught in school. To start, lessons about 9/11 are taught on the anniversary of the attacks as a memorializing event. It is generally taught in a simplistic and nationalistic way, focusing on how it was a shocking and unprecedented attack on US soil that resulted in the global community at large standing beside the US in their efforts to combat the terrorists responsible for the attacks. A lot of emphasis is also placed on the heroism of the first responders, many of whom lost their lives that day or in the years that followed as a result of health complications resulting from the rescue efforts. There will frequently be personal testimonials as well, with teachers or guest speakers talking about their memories and emotions from the day the attacks happened. However, because US history classes are taught chronologically and September the 11th falls at the beginning of the school year, the events of that day are taught out of order so that the day itself can be memorialized. That means that there is no surrounding context about American actions in the Middle East in the decades leading up to the attacks or the war that followed them, and only a very simplistic view of a shocked world unifying to stand behind the United States. In some schools, the narrative is even as simple as terrorists attack the United States because they hate freedom. Around the world, however, how the attacks are taught varies greatly depending on that country's relationship with the United States and the religious makeup of the nation. Countries with whom the US has somewhat strained relations may be far more critical of the US response. Although acts of terror are universally condemned, at least in official textbooks, these nations often focus more on the aftermath of the attacks and the perceived illegality of the United States' actions afterwards, particularly the war in Iraq. In Islamic countries, textbooks don't refer to the attackers as Islamic fundamentalists, with varying degrees of obfuscation. For example, in Pakistani textbooks, they are described as unidentified terrorists, while Turkish textbooks contain the attackers' names but omit the fact that they were Muslim. These textbooks also tend to focus heavily on the civilian casualties in the wars that followed 9/11 and how the war on terror disproportionately affected Muslim countries. There are smaller differences as well, down to individual word choices. Depending on how they want to present the events, the words attackers or terrorists might be replaced with the word individuals. Accurately describing the events while using words with incredibly different connotations allows textbook authors to subtly influence how the events might be perceived by readers. But while different countries emphasize different aspects of 9/11 and the related events, perhaps the most disparate recounting of events comes from China. In China, 9/11 is taught as a sign that America's dominance as the world's #1 superpower was coming to an end, largely glossing over the impact of terrorism around the world and instead focusing on geopolitical shifts from the perceived weakening of the US. All of that said, we're likely to see shifts over time in how the events leading up to, on, and following 9/11 are taught around the world. It's extremely rare for an event to make it into history textbooks less than a decade after it happened, meaning that none of the surrounding context is presented alongside it. In time, the disparities in how the events are taught around the world may disappear, but there's no telling how long that will take or how similar the various accounts will become.